Everybody settled. Good morning, everyone. My name is Mireya Solis. I'm the director of the Center for Asia Policy Studies in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. It is our great pleasure to host this event, looking at how emerging technologies in the context of deepening geopolitical divides are producing a major reorientation in the policies of the United States, of Japan, and of the U.S. Japan alliance, a transformation of that alliance. The profound change afoot was evident in the outcomes of the Biden-Kishida summit that happened just a few weeks ago. And to me, one of the elements that was most striking is that technology really became the thread that connected so many of the important lines of effort, from semiconductors and artificial intelligence to clean energy and space, and to the co-development and co-production of defense equipment. We're particularly delighted to have this important conversation as we welcome back the Mount Fuji delegation to Washington and to our stage. And for today's event, we have assembled a panel of distinguished Japanese lawmakers and renowned policy experts. I would like to introduce them to you briefly in the order in which I will ask them to offer brief framing remarks. So Ono Keitaro is Deputy Chair of the General Council of the Liberal Democratic Party, Chief Secretary of the Economic Security Promotion Headquarters at the party, and former State Minister for Cabinet Affairs in charge of economic security and disaster management. Mark Muro is Senior Fellow in the Metro Program at Brookings and a leading scholar of place-based industrial strategy. Suzuki Keisuke is Deputy Chair of the LDP's Policy Research Council, former State Minister for Foreign Affairs, and former State Minister of Finance. Valerie Wirtschafter is a fellow in the Foreign Policy and Artificial Intelligence and Emergency Technology Initiative at Brookings, and she's an expert on AI governance and democratic resilience. And last but not least, James Schaaf is Senior Director of the U.S. Japan Next Alliance Initiative in Sasakawa Peace Foundation, USA. Jim is a leading expert on Japanese foreign policy, and his work is unique in bridging security and technology issues. So we're going to start then with opening remarks, and I think you'll see through the points made by the panelists that we're going to talk about technology, both sides, the promotion side and the protection side, because they are really central to how these countries are thinking about the challenges ahead, and they're also very much shaping the agenda for the alliance. So Ono-san, I would like to start with you, please. You have unique expertise here. What are the opportunities and challenges as Japan thinks about the promotion of cutting-edge technology?
Okay.
Is it working?
It's cutting-edge technology.
I know. I guess we're getting a bad mark here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having us, and it's a wonderful occasion for me too, and it's very honor for me to be here. And I have to apologize in advance for my poor English skill. Sometimes I don't even understand what I am talking about myself. So and my English is drinking time purpose. So let me switch to Japanese. I'm sorry for that.
Are we okay? Well, today I would like to talk about the science and technology and geopolitical issues. This is a very important aspect of the alliance as well, especially the science and technology as well as the economy have a lot of impact on the geopolitical situation. So I myself am looking at security as well as technology and science and the tools that provides so that we can can seek stability in a geopolitical agenda. Especially economy and technology is seeing a lot of development, and as democratic nations, we can work together to stabilize the situation. So I'd like to talk about some issues from that perspective. The one is that in the current situation, for example, when we think about China, China is using its market power to coerce the other countries, or they're using the pressure not to buy. And they're also striking the supply chain choke points, so the pressure not to sell to those supply chain. So now how can we retain our superiority against China? When we talk about superiority, one is relative and the other is absolute superiority. Which one do we have to do? In the area of technology, there are many different technologies. For example, semiconductors. Semiconductors are a game changer. Semiconductors can change the peace and stability the situation, and that means that we have to have absolute superiority in this area. And related to that, there's a technology called AI and other biotechnologies, alongside other many technologies. Quantum, nuclear fusion, these are also with the possibility of game-changing. So these are the areas that we need to focus on when it comes to investment, especially. However, is it enough to just look at these areas that I mentioned going forward? As a nation, we have to do SWOT analysis, looking at strength and weakness and analyze in a practical way. So what could be the threat to the nation? Where are we more superior? And so that we can make sure that we can win geopolitically. And we have to build our industry based on that analysis. So with that said, protection and promotion are both very important. Starting with promotion side, it's not just about putting money into whatever we want to achieve, but it's not just about the nation, but this is more about the private sector, meaning that for investment, public and private sectors will have to work together. And also, we need to cooperate within the international community so that we can invest, each nation can invest in the areas that they are good at. Or what I call is the gateway investment. Not just the subsidy, but also we can support the procurement, which is the exit side support. So this is to, again, make sure that this industry can grow in the future. So it's not just about the investment or money, but we also need to work on standardization on the international level. And also, we need to invest in people as well. It's quite important because of the labor shortage these days. I don't have a lot of time, so I would like to switch to the protection side now. Now, regarding protection, this is one of the major issues that the Japanese government is working on. This covers a wide variety of areas. One is the export restriction, looking at semiconductors only. Since this relates to the military area, we need to work on protection of semiconductor export. This falls under Wassenaar Arrangement, or does it fall under Wassenaar Arrangement? So we would like to expand the interpretation of Wassenaar Agreement so that we can, we are actually taking on the export control on semiconductors. And U.S. has taken that one step further are already, but we need to harmonize our approach towards the export control on semiconductors. Otherwise, private companies will have a difficult time understanding the situation. In any case, international framework on the export restriction is quite important. And another side is how we can evaluate the direct investment into Japan. This is something Japan is working on right now. And another side is the how we can support the industry by making subsidies and how we do that. If we stick with the WTO rules only when it comes to subsidy, it is not really fitting to the current situation in the world. We have to think about how we can pay subsidies for the supply chain that is reliable, that doesn't infringe on human rights in other countries. In addition to that, data. How we control the data flow over different borders. And there are some points related to that. So we need to work with the private sector, and also we need to work with partner countries. So in that sense, partnership is very important. So in addition to protection and promotion, partnership is very important. So that's called 3 Ps, right? So partnership includes promotion and protection. So I think I talked enough already. So I will end here. Thank you.
San, you covered a lot of ground on both the promotion and protection side and offer a Japanese perspective on these very important issues. And now I would like to turn to you, Mark. And we could say that the United States is having an industrial policy moment. And this was not the case a few years back. Maybe it's a simplistic way to refer to this, but we think about the Washington Consensus, where, it was mostly about the mistakes of direct state intervention in the economy, subsidization, picking winners, all of that. But we're in a very different situation today. So could you speak about why this has happened? What are the drivers for the United States to be now reconsidering the merits and doing a lot actually now in industrial policy?
Oh, absolutely, and thanks so much for having us all, and thank you to all our guests today. Excellent moment for this discussion, and it is about moments. The new moment in the United States around industrial strategy is quite new, and we don't necessarily know where it's heading. And so I'll just say a few words about where this came from. Maria's laid out the backdrop, which was of essentially a laissez-faire ethos within reason, and this is a quite different moment. Central governments around the world have in recent years been adopting more purposeful policies in the last 5 years or so to boost clusters, especially in nationally strategic industries, such as my colleague was discussing. And advanced manufacturing, semiconductors, clean energy, and the like have all been objects of interest to those thinking about industrial policy. They're deploying targeted public investments into key sectors in order to unlock the power of innovation, talent, and markets to deliver long-term growth. That's the objective. And so the U.S. is doing that with, I would say, an exclamation point, even if it is a sudden arrival, and at least for the moment, again, moments. The past 3 years have seen 3 major spending bills: the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that contains elements of industrial strategy, certainly the CHIPS and Science Act that you have likely heard of, and the Inflation Reduction Act with its focus on clean energy technologies. These have driven literally several $1 trillion in direct public investment into investment incentive and investment incentives into the nation's advanced industry sector. A good bit of it with bipartisan support, and we'll talk a little bit about where that came from. But at the same time, private companies have announced on their own something like $700 billion in advanced commitments to these key industries, partly in response to the new federal efforts, which have been a stimulant. What is driving these developments? Most of the drivers are well known in both of our countries and range from the weakening of over-globalized supply chains, I think, a reconsideration of that, concerns about the vulnerability of supply chain systems after the Fukushima shock was seen around the world, and the pandemic, and then multiple geopolitical stresses, all part of this. But here I want to stress my own slightly idiosyncratic view of the top drivers here. And along these lines, I'm going to suggest the most acute drivers in U.S. economic activism in recent years entail the drift of our domestic advanced industry sectors. China's continued economic bellicosity has clearly been a factor. The damage visited by all of these dynamics on many American communities. There's a regional sense to this dynamic. Deindustrialization has led to social and community pain. And then the resulting rise of social divides and backlash politics. I think it's all kind of tied together. I'm interested in the extent to which our Japanese colleagues share some of these concerns, but let me just say a little more about each of these. To the first issue, insufficient investment and an excessive embrace of laissez-faire economic doctrines in the United States assured that by 2020, America's critical advanced industry sectors have been severely weakened in the face of global competition. Just one factoid here, the U.S. share of global output in these key industries dropped from about 29% in 2001 to just 18% in 2018, heading into the pandemic crisis. Relatedly, China has continued through the last decade to subsidize its production, not just of commodity manufacturing goods, but now of the advanced output, solar gear, precision equipment, AI, digital infrastructure, and biotech. I would note that the China competition has emerged as a key point of Republican and Democratic convergence. At a time where there's not a whole lot of consensus, this is one of the central agreement points, for better or worse. Broadening these drivers of industrial activism and giving them real edge, though, as I was suggesting, has been the epidemic of worker and community disruption that has resulted from the nation's industrial decline, accentuated by the so-called China shock. These impacts ensured that industrial decline spoke to the middle class in the United States as an emotional issue and ensured that scores of heartland communities were hit directly and hard and were left behind. And that has been a strong part of the discussion of the move towards industrial strategy. And then this has eroded the socioeconomic consensus in which any strong democracy rests, and surely has contributed to the nation's epidemic of polarization and anti-system voting. It seems like a long jump to get from industrial to industrial strategy from that, but I think these are tied. The absence of a sound national response to deindustrialization looked like neglect to a lot of folks. And that, too, added to the appeal of industrial interventions now. So those are some of the most acute drivers I see. Be interesting to hear how much the guests here, how much we all overlap and what you all see in Japan across some of these issues. My suspicion is these concerns are not unique. They're in some ways global. Country after country is suffering from certain stresses and beginning to respond with a more active economic stance. So I look forward to hearing more from my fellow panelists, and we'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was really fascinating, and I think it's important that you frame it that it's not just a narrow focus on industrial policy, but it connects to geopolitics, connects to the health of democracy and social cohesion and so forth. So that was very interesting. Suzuki-san, if I may ask you to talk about Japan's economic security approach. Ono-san already mentioned the promotion and protection. On the protection side, I would say that the more we advance in technological innovation, we are going in a digital direction, we are wired, and that means that information security, for example, is critical, cybersecurity is critical. So I wonder, what is your take about how Japan's economic security policy is shaping up, and perhaps on these other protection elements that are so important?
Okay, well, thank you, Chair. And thank you for the special guest today to coming to this event. My name is Keisuke Suzuki. I'm the 5th term elected member of parliament, former state minister of foreign affairs and former state minister for finance. So I'm not the specialist on a technology issue, and I would like to leave technology stuff for Ono-san. He's a specialist on technology issue. So that, but I like to touch upon these issues from the context of what kind of the thought the policymakers in Japan thinking about making the economic security policies or the information securities. Our general understanding is that the reason why we should discuss this kind of issues seriously, I think there would be two big reasons, I think. One is the very aggressive Chinese behavior in this decade. Vis-a-vis like 2-20 years ago, I think the Chinese behavior become much hawkish, aggressive in many area. Not only in the purely national security issue, but also in economic or the information or technological, those area. That is one of the reason why we need to talk about this topic seriously. And the second topic would be the digital transformation. So I think that all the society or economy or the national security stuff, I think it became very different vis-a-vis 20 years ago. So I think these two are the biggest driver that why we have to take this issue seriously. And so for instance, let me remind of the Taiwan's presidential election in this January. Many specialist experts point out that some of the Chinese influence can be seen in the Taiwanese presidential election. Of course, in result, William Lai had won the election, so that the not big change of the result have been seen, but we can see certain amount of the impact was there. And in addition to that, we can see many of the deepfake type of the stuff, even in Japan and the United States. I do think that the regulation on TikToks in this country is one of that phenomena. And the reason why our Prime Minister Kishida is launching the plan to set a platform to discuss about the global regulation on generative AI is because of that reason. And I think that this kind of measure is the measure that we need to talk about it seriously in this coming 1-2 years. And in the context of the traditional security stuff, I think that many of the experts point out that on day zero of the Taiwan contingency situation, China would make a cyber attacks on key points in Japan, in Taiwan, in U.S. It would be include the power plants or the military facilities or financial market or those kind of the key elements. So how to defend for those kind of the new arena like cyber or space is a very important key issue now. And in that context, what Japan had proposed was how to make a reaction for that globally. So for instance, the DFFT, or Data Free Flow with Trust, which is raised by former Prime Minister Abe in 2021, is one of the proposal that we have taken. And the reason why is that now the security, that security term includes many security, includes economic security, and also the information security. And especially the democratic society like Japan, United States, or Taiwan, we are the most vulnerable part in that context. So I think that we should work hard on it. And especially the protection side, it is very needed, I think. And about the, let me touch upon briefly on economic security in general. The way we, the Japanese politician, thinking about economic security is that we need to maximize our strategic autonomy and strategic indispensability. Especially the indispensability issue is a more and more important side, I think, because the autonomy side sometimes lead us to the protectionism or the Buy American or such kind of direction, and that is a kind of the trade-off issue with the free trade. So what we need to focus on is strategic or indispensability issue. And the area should be, as Ono-san said, AI or the quantum computings or the high-end semiconductors. Those should be the area that we need to invest a lot in the cooperation with public and private sectors. And I think that the time is limited, so we, Japan or United States or like-minded countries should work together on this issue. And in addition, what is important is these topics is not the topics only for developed countries. It should be the topics which have a very big impact on developing countries. And this would be the very, very critical area that China and our camp would compete severely. So how to share this kind of the idea from our side to the developing countries, in especially the global south countries, is really the key issue, I think. So that's it.
Thank you very much, Suki-san. That was really fascinating. And let me then go to Valerie. And, you know, when we think about the enormous potential of emerging technologies, it really depends on whether we can handle them, whether we can manage them, whether we have rules and standards and safeguards in place. So I'm talking about governance, if you will. So, Valerie, I know that you work very deep in this topic. Can you share with us what are the challenges of, say, AI governance, given that AI is poised to transform everything? And can we actually develop cooperation with like-minded partners, or are there going to be difficulties because we see this issue differently? What do you think there is the work ahead when we think about the governance of AI?
Yes, hello. Okay. Oh, I can hear myself. Anyway, so maybe I will talk a little bit about the state of governance conversations in the U.S. with respect to AI technology, and then maybe because of just how interrelated they are, talk a little bit about where these conversations are on data privacy and also cybersecurity questions, both internationally and domestically. So first on AI, of course, there's quite a bit of attention to generative AI, especially in the launch of ChatGPT. I'm sure we'll talk about this more in the panel in terms of generated disinformation and the potential to sort of flood online spaces, especially with just completely generated content. But of course, it's a rapidly evolving conversation, much broader than just generative AI content. So we've seen quite a bit of movement on the domestic side, at least last year. There were something like 60 bills proposed in Congress. The Senate had bipartisan, what they called AI insight forums that brought experts in to talk about various facets of AI policy, from bias to economic issues to, disinformation, et cetera. in the aftermath of that, we haven't seen as much progress or as much movement this year. I think some of that is, of course, election related. And so in the interim, we've seen states step in. There's about 18 states that have AI legislation now on the books. It's usually fairly narrow, sometimes focused on elections, sometimes on algorithmic decision-making systems. We've also seen the White House make some moves in this space. There was the executive order last fall that looked at responsible development of AI systems. There was a progress report sort of 180 days since, just a couple days ago, that looked at progress on some of the areas that were outlined in that executive order. This followed on voluntary commitments from tech companies last July around safety in AI systems and risk mitigation efforts, and also the AI Bill of Rights, Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, which looked at sort of a rights-based approach to developing AI technology. There's been a lot of other sort of movement as well, but we can maybe talk about that later. But the challenge in this context is that either it's not binding or it can be rescinded if a new administration decides to do so. Internationally, in the U.S. context, the goal is really to, I think, continue being a leader in shaping these AI governance conversations. Progress has been incremental, but I think there's also sensitivities to stifling innovation, particularly given the concentration of AI companies in the U.S. However, the U.S. government did sign the OECD's AI principles, the Hiroshima process, the Bletchley Declaration, and I just saw a couple of days ago that they're beginning intergovernmental dialogue with China, actually, around AI governance, which I'm sure we can talk more about as well. Of course, the AI moment that we're in is both shaping and shaped by other tech conversations. Maybe the most obvious is data privacy, considering that data is a clear input in a lot of AI systems. We already have some protections in the U.S. around, for example, medical data, but sort of comprehensive federal legislation has been elusive for quite some time. Again, in the interim, states have stepped in, much like what we are seeing with AI policy now. However, that has created some roadblocks as well to a more comprehensive federal data privacy policy, simply because the possibility that federal legislation is maybe more lenient than state legislation, but overrides state legislation, for example. However, many in the data privacy community are very there was sort of a renewed life breathed into this space just last month. There was a new proposal around a data privacy bill at the federal level that got through some of these sticking points. It was supported by the senator who had previously stopped an effort last year out of concerns about this state overriding process. So we'll see how that goes. Again, election year, can it get through? And then, of course, we have implementation challenges. We've seen this with the GDPR in the EU around implementation of data privacy laws. And so those are, I think, kind of the challenges around data privacy. And then, of course, thinking about cybersecurity, again, AI both augments, this is like the theme of everything, both harms and potentially helps in cybersecurity processes. On the harm side, of course, basic cyber hygiene, facial recognition technology, voice confirmation, things like that are going to need to be adapted, especially as voice cloning tools become more widely available. Personalization for spear phishing to create that kind of social engineering that leads you to open that weird file that showed up in your inbox. We're going to get rid of those grammatical errors, might be a little bit more tailored and persuasive with a lot less effort. There are already models out there on the dark web that can create malware, open source adaptations to a GPT-like model to help build malware. So that's going to, of course, lower the cost of some of this activity, which has typically been in the purview of nation states. And so we might see broader experimentation with some of these tools too. Of course, there's the benefits as well, and I feel like we don't often talk enough about the benefits. AI can be helpful in data mining huge troves of data, looking at anomaly detection, things like that. So I think it's, about balancing those challenges for sure. We've seen international collaboration for quite some time around cybersecurity. I think it dates back like 2 decades or so. Thinking about norms, standards, confidence building measures was, I think, quite big. The ways that international law applies to the cyber domain. I think there has been some stumbling blocks in the past decade, though, because of Russia and some of the activities in Ukraine. And then, of course, there are always questions around accountability, which I think is a huge challenge. But beyond that sort of global governance space, we've seen sort of partnerships and initiatives. I think I saw actually this morning the UK, the U.S., and Canada issued an alert about Russian cyber activity. So whether it's around information sharing, capacity building with allies, either in sort of smaller partnerships or, for example, I think 3 years ago, the U.S. government launched what they call the Counter Ransomware Initiative. That has something like 50 countries involved now. And so I think that there's a lot of interest in working with partners, particularly given that a lot of the cyber attacks, the sort of big ones that we've seen, cross national borders. And so it's not a national level question. I think domestically, we've seen quite a bit of interest from administration to administration. The Biden administration released a cyber strategy, I believe, last year that had a pillar focused on international collaboration. The EO on AI and the voluntary commitments that I mentioned also had cybersecurity components to them. So it's certainly, I think, this whole space is very much, as Mark said, a bipartisan area of interest. I hope that it stays that way. And of course, given the way that data flows, it's a cross-national challenge. And so I think that we're going to see continued interest in international collaboration too.
Thank you very much, Valerie. That was really very interesting and very comprehensive and highlighting the perils and opportunities of these technologies. So, Jim, if I can turn to you next. I mean, you've been watching the U.S. Japan relation, like me, for many, many years. We're not going to date ourselves in how old we are, but nevertheless, how do you see, can you offer some top-line comments on how do you see technology affecting, transforming the U.S.-Japan relationship?
Sure. Thank you very much, Mireya, for the opportunity today and all of you being here. I'm going to expand a little bit on a point that Ono-sensei made regarding kind of harmonizing U.S.-Japan economic security policies. I'm going to drive it even further because I think it's so important. Despite all the attention to U.S.-China strategic competition and the importance of economic security, so far the impact on trade has been relatively mild and narrow. But that seems to be changing, and I think if Donald Trump is elected again as U.S. president in November, that change is going to accelerate. For the sake of preserving a stable, rules-based economic order in the Indo-Pacific, I think the United States and Japan should try to go beyond just managing differences in their economic security policies and seek instead to harmonize them with other nations at a minimum necessary level to protect national security with maximum multilateral support. The idea is to leverage the U.S.-Japan alliance to go beyond a hub-and-spoke approach to economic security policy coordination to more of a framework. So the U.S. and China still account for about 40% of global GDP. They remain among each other's top trading partners. The U.S. has been China's largest trading partner for several years, and while China has slipped to third for the U.S. behind Mexico and Canada, this understates China's influence by not counting re-exports of mostly Chinese-made goods from other countries. And China's investment in Mexico, in particular, is increasing rapidly. China's leadership in critical minerals makes it a vital part of the global economy at a most basic level. It's the world's largest producer of 22 metals and 7 industrial minerals. Just a few Chinese export restrictions on gallium, for example, has doubled the metals price in a year. And meanwhile, U.S. imports of Chinese goods and services from China hit a record $563 billion in 2022. So you might say this fear of economic decoupling is overstated. But the U.S. push to de-risk economic ties with China in pursuit of national security related to supply chains, investment, protecting innovation, is having an impact. China is taking similar steps. So like a river being diverted by new obstacles in its path, I think new economic security policies will alter the global trade and investment landscape over time. For example, China's total share of U.S. exports and imports is dropping down to its lowest level in at least a decade. And that high U.S. import figure from China in 2022, well, that dropped in 2023 to its lowest point since 2012. U.S. private equity investment in China has also retreated to where it stood in 2019. Global foreign direct investment in China has dropped to less than 10% of its peak in 2021. And meanwhile, China's stockpile of U.S. government debt hit a lowest level in 14 years during 2023, and its decline is accelerating. So these are just a few symptoms of change stimulated, I think, by economic security policies related to export controls, investment restrictions, subsidies for reshoring, tech research, and the like. And these policies are more pronounced in the United States compared to other countries, despite the Biden administration's approach to build a high fence around only a small yard. But Japan and European nations are implementing some of them as well. So the U.S. government now, if you look at Congress and some of the policies being discussed going forward, is poised to widen the definition of economic security and the scale of its interventions in ways that I think could be more disruptive to global trade and investment flows, and possibly drive the allies apart. If you look at the U.S. Congress and Trump administration, past and potentially future officials, they're pushing for even wider coverage. And this more restrictive atmosphere is already evident in the behavior of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS, which set records in 2022 for the highest number of withdrawal refiles and mitigation agreements, despite a drop in Chinese applications. So this was applied to all investments in the United States. The definition of economic security in the U.S. is expanding to include artificial intelligence, data governance, agriculture, and other areas, manifesting itself in the banning of video app TikTok, unless China its owner sells its stake, and President Biden's executive order to prevent access to Americans' bulk sensitive personal data by countries of concern, primarily China. So the U.S. uses a variety of mechanisms to try to coordinate economic security policies with other countries, notably with Japan. The EPCC, Economic Policy Consultative Committee, or Economic 2+2, is a main one for us, but there are similar, although all slightly different, meetings and forums and mechanisms to work with the EU, South Korea, India, Israel, and others. But I don't think this hub-and-spoke approach, bilateral approach, is feasible if Washington keeps expanding the scope and intensity and nationalist flavor of economic security measures. So mini and multilateral forums have been addressing this, the G7, the Quad, U.S. Japan, South Korea, Chip 4 Alliance concept, and they might help mitigate some of the worst of excesses of future U.S. economic security policy. But the common denominator here is U.S. Japan in almost all of these different connections. So I would say the goal is not to weaken economic security, but prioritize only the most important vulnerabilities in concert with other nations. Stronger unilateral measures will not strengthen U.S. economic security. So I think the strategy could be twofold. First, to develop more effective but milder policies buoyed by wider international support, and then leverage the argument of effectiveness to help keep U.S. policymakers satisfied with a less disruptive, non-unilateral approach. And I think as I said, the U.S. Japan is the common denominator, the common factor in all of these forums. So I think the alliance can and should be a starting point for harmonizing economic security policies with as many countries as possible. Of course, if we do limit the excess of trade and investment restrictions, that puts even more importance on the innovation side to try to stay ahead. So here again, I think U.S.-Japan bilateral action aimed at being an enabler or a catalyst for many-lateral agreements in the promotion side can be effective. We see it working in the defense technology side a little backwards with the AUKUS Pillar 2 discussion, for example, which is bringing Japan in, but there are other U.S.-Japan initiatives, basic science and emerging technology that could be a catalyst going in the other direction. So I'll leave it there.
Terrific, Jim. Thank you. So, you all had very rich set of comments. A lot has been put on the table. I had a lot of discussion questions. I'm going to now shorten them because I want to make sure that the audience has a chance to also ask questions of all of you. So when I think about the different set of questions that I have, I think of them in three baskets, and therefore I'll just have one question on each basket, a combined long question. One is the basket of economic competitiveness and how these technologies are critical for charting the path forward in securing prosperity, rising living standards, and so forth. The other basket has to do with national security risks, vulnerabilities, the geopolitics, and how these technologies intersect with that. And then the last basket, which I had thought of a U.S. Japan agenda, I think, as Jim said, it should be the U.S. Japan as the engine or core of a broader network approach or multilateral approach to tackle some of these questions of economic security, technology, promotion, and protection. So you've been warned. There are three questions coming your way, and please jump in and address one another's comments. I would like to make this as interactive as I can. So let me start with the competitiveness angle, and it's a two-pronged question. I'm long for very long questions, but I'll try to simplify. What I think is very interesting about the current industrial policy moment is that when you think about past experience in Asia, and Japan was the paradigmatic developmental state, we're talking about catch-up. And therefore, you knew what the path was ahead, and you were trying to leapfrog and catch up with others. But this is different today because we have global supply chains, but also because we're talking about governments having this ambition to prop up industries at the cutting edge. So we're really talking about the leading industries, which are just forming in front of our eyes. So I guess my question to all of you is, where is this confidence coming from, given that in the past industrial policy has had a very checkered record? It has not always succeeded. What would be the ingredients for success? What types of public-private partnerships, developments of talent, workforce, and so forth? But also, when we go through rapid economic change, not everybody benefits the same, right? And I think that how regions fare in this technological race, inside a country is going to be important. And Mark, you've done a lot of work that has been very influential on the technology hubs. But in the case of Japan, regional disparities are also very important. So how should we think about an industrial policy that is for the frontier, the cutting edge, and also to make sure that these regional disparities do not grow worse?
じゃあ私から。
First of all, regarding the competitiveness, so as everyone mentioned, economic security itself, if you want that to go to the right direction, you have to base everything on freedom. Because when we set up a small yard within the economic security, everyone wants to get this yard bigger and bigger. That leads to the protectionism, as Mr. Suzuki said, and that would make everything less efficient. So personally, what I'm thinking right now is that economic security policy is led by the government right now, but the economy is led by the private sector. So we have to really work with the private sector and cooperate with them to make sure that we know where we are making more money, where we should win, And as Mr. Mura also said, a democracy needs to be established on all of this. So the optimization in all three areas is necessary. And especially working with the private sector is very important. And this is something that we build with the private sector. This is not just about the government leading, but government is just a headquarter for all the different industries in the nation, and work together with the industry to go through this optimization process. And it's not just about the country, but we also need to work with the U.S., and we have to be the headquarters to advance the technology at the same time as secure the economic security. That's what I'm thinking. But unfortunately, we don't have the exact economic security policy yet. We have a package, but it's not a strategy. Because the strategy is to win alongside the private sector and setting the goals related to that. And of course, that would include the regional revitalization. We have to include the rural areas as well. The difference between Japan and the U.S. and in this area is that in Japan, in any rural area in Japan, we're losing people. The population is declining. So if you're able to somehow revitalize these rural areas, that will not help much. So for the industrial policy in the U.S., you have regional strategies, but it is on a different perspective. For example, Rapidus semiconductor program, we are making investments in Hokkaido. As a result, Hokkaido will become richer. And the most advanced semiconductor process is in Kumamoto Prefecture. Kumamoto will become richer. However, for different regions, they will not feel the same benefit. But what we are thinking is rather, of course, the investment is good for different regions, but, for example, if the local municipalities wanted to procure something, for example, if they want to carry out their small to mid-sized enterprise policies, then central government will provide subsidies to them. But that will go through the municipalities to those SMEs in the local region. What do they do with that money? They buy Chinese products because they're cheap. Now, is that good for Japan as a whole? Of course, we do this under WTO. We're not to discriminate against any products from any nations, but we do need to think about a secure supply chain and also human rights issues within the supply chain. So that's something that we need to keep in mind as we pursue prosperity in different regions as well. I would also like to talk about governance. I don't want to monopolize the microphone, so I will stop here.
Thank you. We're running close to a very tight schedule here, but Mark, may you have some comments on these questions?
I'll jump in really quickly. First, picking up on your invitation, confidence can be misplaced. But I actually think we do know more. Recent hardcore economic literature is far more positive on more kinds of intervention. We're not talking about, I think, your parents' generation of champion firms so much. You know, it's much more about the design and execution of sophisticated, multi-partner, multilateral, often regionally based initiatives. And so there's just a much deeper understanding of governance issues, the geography issues that my colleague is talking about, and a richer set of policy instruments. We're not just talking about, subsidies. We're talking about a focus on innovation. We're talking about modern cluster principles, leaning heavily on business, civic, university partnerships, linking national missions with local strategy development, or this is not a top-down vision. It's a hybrid top-down and bottom-up vision that I think we're seeing can work. Leveraging competitive grants, so there's a competition built into it. We're not trying to avoid competition. We're trying to use competition to focus initiatives. And then imposing rigorous and independent selection processes and evaluation. Those are the things that really matter. The last thing, the regional piece is so important. And I think that that is very much on the table in the United States. Arguably, it's one of the major, I would say China and regional deindustrialization are the great motivators. They're close to the center of the whole point. So there's all kinds of thinking about ways that a concentrated cluster can be made to benefit the area around it. Maybe there are specific programs to address particular rural problems. So, I think that I'm quite positive that we are, and optimistic about the beginning of what needs to be a decade of experimentation and idea sharing across the partnerships that we're talking about.
Thank you very much, Mark. I think, Jim, you also, and Suzuki-san.
Just very quickly, and I will end up dating myself here, because if you go back to the early 90s with the U.S. Japan semiconductor trade battles and agreements, we were trying to protect Motorola from Toshiba. We never knew about Qualcomm or NVIDIA, or, if you try to save champions, I think we have learned, hopefully, that lesson. And then the other key piece, Ono-sensei brings up the Rapidus example, which is a true partnership in a way between IBM and Rapidus, and leveraging both kind of government incentives, but the vast majority is still private sector money, but using Albany as a hub where there are Rapidus engineers now working with IBM, but also then collaborating in Hokkaido. So we have to stay open, I think, as partners too. So it's the international piece, in contrast to what's going on with Nippon Steel, for example, and U.S. Steel. Staying open to these kind of partnerships is key, I think.
I think you're right. So no single industrial policy have succeeded before, right? And every growth, every innovation has done by startups or private sector. That's right. And I do think that this economic security concept, so let me say that like 10 years ago, it was very reactive stuff, right? So the China make that market as a kind of leverage to do something, and their government-funded innovation has been the big pressure for us. And the concept of economic security in that context was very reactive one. And we should keep that origin in our mind, I think. So we need to judge whether that issue is more on economic or more on security. And we should minimize the zone, I think. So I think that kind of and who make a judge is a kind of the key point, I think. So maybe the market or some kind of the investors, they would make a judgment, I think. So.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to open a big question next, but I would like us to have very concise answers so I can leave time for questions from the audience. I'm not going to ask my third question. But this has to do with the risks, the vulnerabilities that also drive these conversations we're having about technology. And I think there is an intersection here between geopolitics and domestic politics with these technologies. And, in the past, the question of information security has been one that has been challenging for the United States and Japan because they have had different levels of protection of information, and Japan has adopted some reforms, but it has taken some time, and the question is, where will it go next? So information security has hindered at times security cooperation. So what can we do to make sure that we address potential gaps there? But also why I want to emphasize the domestic politics angle is that this is a year also of elections everywhere. And there's a potential, as Valerie was saying, of using AI for misinformation purposes. And we're keenly aware of that in the United States, but I think it would also be important to highlight how that relates to the situation in Japan and how would that be perhaps an issue where both countries work together. I gave you a huge question and I'm giving you just a few minutes to answer it, but please, we have to go to the audience. So just very sharp, concise remarks from anyone here. I think, Valerie, you're ready to go.
I'm ready to go. No, I'm not. I think that there's a huge question mark as to what role AI is going to play in this kind of disinformation context. Of course, false content, decontextualized content, sort of hyper-partisan, really trying to fuel that sort of polarization is not new, just in the same way that sort of these cybersecurity risks that I've hit on are not new either. Of course, there have been evolutions in the way that people get their information, in the way campaigns are run too, and sort of moving toward a more data-driven approach of campaigning. And so we see these vulnerabilities become more prominent, whether it's, sort of in the flooding of the information space. And we're seeing, I think Microsoft has a threat intelligence unit that has highlighted some of the ways that China has been experimenting with AI, both in Taiwan, which I believe you mentioned, but also elsewhere. And so some of the ways that we're going to see maybe some of that take root. But to me, the biggest concern, of course, is sort of local level motivated actors as opposed to national level threats. We saw a little bit of this, I believe it was 2020, with Iran, actually, and targeting local level election officials. And so that, I think, is a huge challenge. I think generative AI brings a new layer of complexity there, certainly, that it could be quite harmful. But I think that there's still certainly just, I think, a broader question in this space about the persuasion effects, the volume, whether the generative component is a necessity to cause information chaos, or can we do that on our own with recycled videos, decontextualized video clips, a good Photoshop edit, things like that.
Thank you very much. Ono-san? Thank you.
日米の情報
The gap, information gap between U.S. and Japan. Right now, the economic security protection infrastructure is being built in Japan, including the new information security clearance system. In Japan, the intelligence capability was not good. Information has to be gathered and protected and has to be issued and issued or used and has meaning. However, we are building infrastructure right now, and then we have to do what we have to do is gathering or collection. And in order to collect the information, private sectors, cooperation and international cooperation has to be established, and then the access has to be established. In that way, the analysis capability will be heightened, and then valuable information can be shared. So that's what I think, and that is a national security plan stipulate that too.
The issue of the AI and election, right? And I think that that's a very fundamental issue of the democracy, actually. So the democracy whose core idea is the one citizen who is judging based on the fact would vote for somebody. And that's the core driver and the core value of the election and democracy, right? So, of course, deepfake, generative AI is one of the issues we need to set up the regulation. But at the same time, we need to keep much broader eyes, I think. So, for instance, like the fake news or the kind of the very biased news. So those are the phenomena in this internet era, right? And before, the authority, like medias or something, would provide a kind of the assist for the people to judging whether it is good or not, right? But now, because those kind of the news articles are so diversified, so people oneself have to make a judgment, and people have to think whether it is biased or not, and people oneself have to make an effort to minimize the bias. So I think that how to set that kind of the framework is a kind of a big challenge for us, and it should not be done only by the government or regulations, I think. So I think this would be a much broader topics, I think.
Thank you very much, Suzuki-san. So let me now turn to the audience. There are microphones going around. If you can raise your hand and please identify yourself and a very short question. So I'm going to take 2 questions at a time. I see the gentleman here. Yes.
Yes, my name is Roger Cochetti, and I'm an editorial contributor to the Hill newspaper on technology policy. And my question is that from my perspective, the elephant in the room in this discussion is how anyone on the panel responds to the Chinese narrative about this exact same subject. And for those who don't follow it, the Chinese narrative is that for 50 years, the Americans have lectured everybody in the world that we need open and free trade, free flow of information, and as long as it was protecting IBM, Cisco, Google, and Facebook, that was good. But the minute that Hawaii and TikTok outcompete Facebook and Cisco, then protectionism is good. We all should be protecting. So what do you say to Argentina and Chile and Brazil and Indonesia and Thailand, who have for decades been told that protectionism is very bad, unethical, and evil, and now, oh, oops, it's okay?
Thank you very much. And then we had a lady in the back.
Hi, I'm Chitrali, and I'm a master's student at Georgetown University. My question was about... Hi, Professor Liv. Okay, my question was to Ono Sensei or Suzuki Sensei. It is about recently we have seen these major big tech investing, American big tech investing in Japan, especially be it cybersecurity or cloud computing. In that sense, do you think that the domestic tech industry of Japan is getting enough, resources or not? We have examples of Sakana AI, we have Sakura Internet, which are getting, a lot of procurements from the Japanese government. But how is that balance happening between domestic industry and American tech?
Thank you very much. Any replies from the panel?
I have a reply to the first question. I think you're exactly right. I don't have an answer to your question, but I also regionally look at Latin America, and from, you mentioned Argentina and Brazil, and I think it opens up a huge credibility gap, especially for regions that have had sort of testy relationships in the past with the U.S., whether it's sort of Cold War legacies, support for dictatorship, things like that. And the hypocrisy question, I think, is a huge sticking point and something that really resonates domestically in a lot of these contexts. We're seeing it play out in real time, whether it's in, convincing these countries to come along around sanctions on Russia and the like. And so I think that there is, an increasing recognition, and, I would say that this has always been the case in some respects, but certainly, at least in now, a recognition that, there's certain policies that are convenient, and when they apply, and when they don't, we push for democracy in Venezuela, but we embrace other countries where democracy isn't fruitful. And so I think that is, that sort of messaging is getting hammered home quite aggressively. And so there's sort of been a strategic shift to just fence sitting in some respects and playing both sides, because China is a huge player, especially in South America, and, in parts of Africa and the like. And so I think that, it's not an either or question for a lot of these countries anymore. It's a, can we play them off each other and get benefits from both?
Thank you. Okay, I have response from almost everyone. So, Jim.
Sorry, just very quickly on that point. I mean, I understand that and agree with it to some extent, but I would particularly drive home China's behavior in economic coercion, particularly without any legal basis or any transparency. And even though we're not perfect on this either, I would go back to certainly Japan and U.S. Japan's emphasis on rules-based order, rule of law, the free and open Indo-Pacific concept is supposed to be rooted in not a might makes right or a market power makes right approach, but a rules-based approach. So I would try to drive that home and try to get the U.S. to stick to it as much as possible to give it credibility.
Thank you. Suzuki-san, and then Ono-san. Suzuki-san.
Well, about first question, I don't think that it's not the like American company is good and or Japanese company is good and Chinese company is bad issue. I think that the point would be that there are no purely private Chinese firm, and most or all of the Chinese firm is really influenced or ordered by Chinese government. And that fact would lead us for the security issue, not the protectionism or the free market issue. That is my brief answer for first question. And for the second question, I think that, of course, we want to see the situation that the Japanese firms win the competition with the United States firms. I'm sorry for that, but the fact is that U.S. and Japan is like-minded country. We share the values. So we inevitably have to welcome our U.S. Big investment for Japan. And that is not the stuff that we need to reject.
Thank you. And Ono-san, the last words of the panel go to you.
短くいきますけれども、
I'll keep it short. Regarding the protectionism, I do understand, and we know that there is a criticism related to that. But what is the issue there? As Jim said, there is a rule for international community. This is not equipped for the economic coercion that is imposed by China. So that means that we need to have a new international rule that can work with the kind of coercion that China is doing. But if only the U.S. is doing it, or if only Japan is doing it, then we will be criticized. So that means that we need to have a new set of rules internationally. Of course, that cannot be done overnight. So we have to work with partner countries, or maybe in AUKUS or IPEF. So we have to start small so that it becomes more broader and go up to WTO level, maybe. But of course, there is a question of, about the second question. About if we have enough resources in Japan. Japanese companies tend to have smaller capital compared to the U.S. Companies. So we do have issues of maybe the Japanese companies are not as well equipped for the risks. And of course, we have a shortage of human resources. But what we are doing as a Japanese government is the re-skilling of employees of Japanese nationals. So we do have a platform of that. So I won't go into detail about that because we don't have time.
Hours to continue this conversation, but probably you have things to do and the audience as well. Please join me in thanking the panelists for a terrific discussion.